imagine joining the most powerful army in the world, only to discover that your first battle isn't against an enemy, it's against your own body. In Rome, recruits trained with weapons twice the weight of real ones, marched until their feet split open, and drilled until exhaustion dropped them to the ground. Some never even made it to war. To the empire, that was the point. This is the brutal story of the army that killed its own to make it stronger. Imagine Rome at the height of its power. Marble temples glittering under the Mediterranean sun. Marketplaces echoing with the hum of trade. Senators draped in fine togas debating the affairs of the known world. And beyond those city walls, an army unlike any other, a machine of flesh, iron, and discipline that had conquered continents. To be a Roman soldier was to stand at the very edge of human endurance, and then be pushed beyond it. But the glory you saw in parades, the triumphal marches through the Forum, the laurel crowns handed to victorious generals, that was the end of a journey. The beginning was far less noble. The Roman army did not simply accept men into its ranks. It broke them. It stripped away everything soft, everything weak, until what remained was either steel or nothing at all. To the Romans, war was the lifeblood of the state. From the time of the Republic to the height of the empire, expansion was constant. New provinces meant new enemies, new terrain, new challenges, and victory depended on soldiers who would not falter, no matter the conditions. That meant training wasn't just preparation, it was a crucible. Recruits had to be transformed into instruments of war, and the process was as merciless as the enemies they would face. A young man entering the legions might be a farmer, a laborer, or the son of a craftsman. He might have calloused hands, but he had never worn armor that could weigh over 20 kilograms, or marched for 30 kilometers without rest, or swung a blade hundreds of times until his shoulders screamed for mercy. The Roman army knew this, and their answer was simple. If you could not endure training, you had no place in battle. It began with the weapons. Not the ones they would carry into war, but heavier, deadlier versions designed to punish the body. A real Roman Gladius weighed around 1 kilogram, but a recruit's practice sword the Rudis could weigh twice as much. Their shields were the same. The training scutum could feel like hauling a slab of stone. Every swing, every block, every drill was done under greater strain than they would ever face in real combat. The philosophy was brutal but effective. If you could fight with these, real weapons would feel light in your hands. Then came the marching. The Roman legions were famous for their speed and endurance, covering enormous distances in short time. That was no accident. New recruits were driven to march day after day, carrying full-gear weapons, armor, rations, tools, sometimes up to 45 kilograms in total. The ground didn't matter. Hills, mud, rocky terrain, blazing heat, biting cold. Rest stops were rare, water was rationed, and complaints were ignored. Your legs would burn, your back would ache, and your mind would scream to stop, but stopping was not an option. Drill instructors, the centurions, were the heart of this cruelty. These men were veterans, scarred and battle-hardened, with a deep hatred for laziness. They didn't see recruits as people. They saw them as raw material, to be shaped or discarded. Orders were barked, punishments were immediate, and failure was met with more repetitions, longer marches, heavier loads. A centurion's vine staff, the vitus, was not just a symbol of authority, it was a tool, and it could land across a man's back for the smallest mistake. Yet physical exhaustion was only half the battle. The Romans believed that fear could be trained out of a man, but only by confronting it constantly. Recruits trained with blunted weapons against each other until bruises covered their bodies. They were made to fight against multiple opponents, forced to keep formation while being shoved, struck, and shouted at. Drills were relentless, because hesitation in battle meant death not just for the soldier, but for the man standing next to him. And even when the day's work was done, there was no real rest. Soldiers built their own camps each night on campaign, digging trenches, erecting palisades, organizing supplies. In training, recruits did the same. Hours of labor after hours of marching and fighting meant that sleep was often short, and recovery was a luxury. The toll was immediate. Some men collapsed from exhaustion. Others suffered heat stroke in the summer or hypothermia in the winter. Injuries from overtraining were common: torn muscles, broken bones, infected blisters, and yes, some died. The army kept marching. Why so harsh? Because to Rome, the army wasn't just a fighting force, it was the spine of the empire. Discipline had to be absolute. A soldier who broke in training would break in battle, and that could cost hundreds of lives. Better to lose a few recruits in camp than an entire cohort on the battlefield. The brutality had another effect too. It bound the survivors together. Shared suffering created bonds that were stronger than blood. The man beside you had endured the same agony, the same punishments, the same nights shivering under the stars. When the time came to fight, you didn't just fight for Rome, you fought for him. And so, the Roman recruit learned quickly. Pain was normal, exhaustion was normal, and survival was never guaranteed. Those who adapted became the backbone of the legions, the soldiers who could march all day, fight all night, and rise again at dawn, ready to do it all over. Those who couldn't simply didn't last. But this was just the beginning. The true horrors of Rome's military training were still to come: the psychological trials, the deadly war games, and the infamous punishments that made men fear their officers more than the enemy. In the Roman army, you didn't just survive the training, you survived because of it. If the first weeks of training broke a man's body, the months that followed sought to break his mind. To the Romans, physical strength was only half the equation. A soldier who feared death, who hesitated at the sight of blood, who wavered under pressure, that man was as dangerous to his comrades as the enemy himself. And so, Rome's training went beyond endurance drills. It became psychological warfare. The training grounds were a place of constant noise, the clash of wooden swords, the bark of orders, the whistle of arrows striking targets. But beneath the rhythm of organized chaos, there was always tension. You never knew when the centurion's shadow would fall across you, when a mistake would turn into a public lesson. Every slip of the shield, every misstep in formation, every sluggish reaction was punished. Not with a quiet word of correction, but with humiliation, extra duties, or a strike from the Vitus. The punishments were designed to remind you of your place. If a man failed to keep his shield high, he might be made to hold it above his head for hours, the weight turning his arms to stone. If a recruit stumbled in a march, he might be forced to carry the packs of 2 other men for the rest of the day. There was no such thing as leniency. Rome was not raising individuals. It was molding parts of a single machine, and a faulty part had to be repaired or replaced. Weapons training grew more intense. At first, recruits sparred with wooden swords and wicker shields, but soon they graduated to live steel-blunted, but still capable of breaking bones and spilling blood. They were pitted against each other in duels, their movements observed by veterans who shouted instructions or insults. You learned to keep your guard up even when your lungs burned, because the moment you dropped it, your opponent would drive the edge of his blade into your ribs hard enough to make you gasp for air. But the Romans did not train their soldiers to fight one-on-one. They trained them to fight as a wall of men, a living fortress. The famous testudo formation, the tortoise required absolute coordination. A single man dropping his shield could expose the entire unit to enemy arrows. Drills for the testudo were relentless, marching in perfect step, shields locked overhead and to the front, enduring a rain of stones, javelins, and even burning projectiles. Recruits learned quickly that a moment's weakness could scorch your flesh or split your skull. Archery practice was equally punishing. Even if you weren't destined to be an archer, every recruit was expected to understand the bow. Hours were spent loosing arrows at distant targets under the midday sun, with the centurion pacing behind, demanding tighter groups, faster release. Miss too many shots, and you were ordered to retrieve every arrow no matter how far it had flown before you were allowed to drink water. Then came the war games. These were not the polite, ceremonial exercises of a parade ground. They were full-scale mock battles fought with blunted weapons, and they were violent enough to leave men with cracked ribs, broken noses, and missing teeth. Cohorts were pitted against each other, sometimes in daylight, sometimes at night with only torches to light the field. Ambush drills taught soldiers to fight in chaos, smoke in the air, horns blaring, men shouting over one another. The line between training and real combat blurred, and injuries were treated as part of the process. And still, Rome pushed harder. The army believed that fear of the enemy must be outweighed by fear of failure. That meant discipline had to be absolute, and disobedience could never be tolerated. For minor infractions, punishments were harsh but survivable. Extra guard shifts, loss of rations, public flogging. But for serious offenses, cowardice, theft, disobedience in battle, the consequences could be fatal. One of the most infamous punishments was decimatio, or decimation. In extreme cases, when a unit had disgraced itself, perhaps by retreating without orders or failing a mission, the entire cohort would be divided into groups of 10. One man from each group would be chosen by lot, and the other 9 would beat him to death. It was rare, but the threat hung over every soldier like a shadow. To know that your own comrades might be ordered to kill you was the purest form of control. Even outside the parade grounds, the tests never ended. Forced marches were a constant, sometimes 20 kilometers in a day, sometimes double that. Recruits were made to wade through rivers in full armor, to dig trenches in frozen soil, to erect fortifications in pouring rain. And when they returned to camp, thinking the day was done, they might be ordered to tear it all down and rebuild it simply as practice. Food was functional, not generous. Bread, porridge, dried meat, sometimes sour wine. Enough to fuel the body, never enough to make you feel comfortable. Water discipline was strict. A man could march for hours in summer heat before being allowed to drink. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion were as much a part of training as sword drills. And yet, there was purpose in every cruelty. Rome's enemies were not soft opponents. Germanic tribes fought with wild ferocity, hurling themselves at the Roman lines in screaming charges. Parthian horse archers could strike from a distance and vanish into the horizon before the legions could respond. To face such threats, a soldier had to be more than brave, he had to be unbreakable. For some, the transformation was real. Men entered the legions as farmers, laborers, shepherds, and emerged as living weapons, their muscles honed, their instincts sharpened, their fear buried deep. For others, the strain was too great. Heat stroke, infections, and training injuries claimed lives each year. Some collapsed on the march and never rose again. In the coldest winters, frostbite took fingers and toes. In the hottest summers, men fell where they stood. And still, the army did not stop. Because, in the eyes of Rome, every dead recruit was a lesson. It meant the survivors were the ones worth keeping, the ones who could march into the unknown and hold the line no matter the odds. Those who endured the ordeal were not just soldiers. They were the embodiment of Rome's will, forged in a process so harsh it bordered on cruelty, but so effective that the legions became the most feared fighting force in the ancient world. But there was a darker truth lurking beneath the discipline. For all its order and precision, Rome's training system was a gamble. By demanding so much, by pushing so far, the army sometimes destroyed the very men it sought to make strong. And as the empire grew older and its wars more desperate, that gamble would become even riskier and even bloodier. By the time a recruit reached the final stages of training, he had already survived what many considered a silent war. The Roman army's philosophy was clear. Only the strongest, most disciplined, most relentless men deserved to wear the legion's crest. But survival was never guaranteed, not even here, far from the battlefield. Ancient historians didn't often dwell on the casualties of training. Glory lay in the victories, not the broken bodies left behind in camp. But the fragments we have paint a brutal picture. Gladius, the 4th century military writer, describes training in detail: weapons heavier than regulation, marches in blistering heat and freezing rain, endless drilling and armor. He praised the system's ability to harden men, but even he hinted at the toll it took. To Vegetius, those who collapsed, those who died, were unworthy of Rome's service. There was no tragedy in their loss, only the reassurance that they would not fail in battle. Archaeology gives us another glimpse. Mass graves near Roman forts sometimes contain the remains of young men, many in their late teens or early 20s, with no signs of battle wounds. Instead, there are stress fractures, evidence of malnutrition, and in some cases, injuries consistent with overtraining, shattered joints, spinal compression, blunt force trauma from repeated impacts. These men never faced the enemy. Their war was against the expectations of the legion, and they lost. And still, the machine rolled forward. A dead recruit meant his place could be filled by another eager volunteer, or more often, a conscript with no choice in the matter. Rome's appetite for soldiers was endless, and the empire's borders were vast. As one man fell, another took his place, and the training cycle began anew. In the final weeks of preparation, the intensity reached its peak. War games turned into near-lethal contests. Recruits fought in shield walls where the blows came harder, faster, and from more angles. Mock sieges were staged, with defenders hurling stones and weighted javelins from ramparts, forcing attackers to climb under a rain of projectiles. Every exercise was designed to simulate not just the chaos of battle, but the shock, the noise, the fear, the sensation that the next moment could be your last. Some exercises went beyond simulation. Roman commanders believed in blooding new soldiers before their first real campaign, sometimes using condemned criminals as live opponents. Though not officially recorded as training, these brutal spectacles blurred the line between preparation and execution. For the recruits, it was a final test. Could they kill without hesitation? Could they face a man's eyes as life drained from them and keep moving forward? If not, they would be removed from the ranks, or worse, made an example of. It was in these last days before deployment that Rome's philosophy revealed its coldest truth. Death in training was not just tolerated, it was anticipated. A centurion might even take pride in the number of men who failed under his command, for it proved he had demanded the highest standard. The army's logic was ruthless. Better to bury a man in camp than on the field, where his weakness could doom an entire cohort. And yet, for those who survived, there was a strange sense of gratitude. The brutality had forged them into something unrecognizable from the men they once were. They could march through sweltering heat or freezing rain without complaint. They could fight for hours without their arms giving way. They could hold formation as arrows blackened the sky above them. And perhaps most importantly, they had learned that fear was a tool, one that could be mastered, or one that could destroy you. These were the soldiers who carried Rome's banners across continents. They were the ones who stormed enemy fortresses, who marched into forests where the trees hid unseen spears, who faced cavalry charges and never broke ranks. Their strength was not an accident. It was purchased with the lives of those who had fallen before them. But this strength came at a cost Rome never counted. Every year, across every province, there were fathers who never saw their sons return from training. Villages lost their young men not to glorious victories, but to exhaustion, disease, and injury within the safety of Roman camps. And as the centuries passed and the empire's enemies grew bolder, the pressure to train harder, faster, and more ruthlessly only increased. The machine that built Rome's strength also quietly drained its lifeblood. The story of Rome's military training is not just one of discipline and strength. It is a story of sacrifice, often unwilling, often unseen, that underpinned centuries of imperial power. It is the tale of men who learned to endure the unendurable, and of those who could not. In the end, the Roman army was not merely a force that defeated its enemies. It was a force that consumed its own to ensure victory. And perhaps that is the truest measure of its power and its cruelty. If you found yourself standing in that frozen field, sword in hand, shield digging into your arm, and a centurion's voice roaring in your ear, would you have survived? Or would your bones be buried in the quiet earth of a forgotten training ground? History remembers the victors, but it's built on the backs of the ones who never made it. If you want to uncover more untold stories from the ancient world, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the truths hidden between them, make sure you stay with us. Rome's secrets are far from over.